Intro, and because it intersects with ACORN, which is I'm originally from South Louisiana, which actually means my ancestors actually hail from your neck of the woods. We were the Acadians who fled. My mother spoke French as a first. I swear I didn't know this before. I swear I didn't know this. My mother spoke French as a first language. She learned English in school, and this was South Louisiana during the post-war period when they were. You know, how dare we have these foreigners live within our border? And there was much like the Latino community is experiencing now, there was this real harsh, you must speak English. My mother was actually sent home from school once for speaking French in the schoolyard, right? That was sort of the culture of South Louisiana in the 50s. Lafayette.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's where I grew up. And I'll just go a little bit about my background. I got into organizing shortly after college. I did the 7-year college program, but shortly after that I got into organizing, and I started working. My first organizing job, full-time organizing job, was with a group called Louisiana Coalition for Tax Justice.
Oh, sure.
Which was Zach Noth and...
You worked for Local 100 for years, my buddy, yeah.
Exactly. So way back in, that was 92, 93, I guess. About 20 years ago, and a lot of our organizing models modeled somewhat loosely on ACORN. Let me say, you know, we did door knocking, we did chapter building as a model, and so that was my first real stint in organizing. I organized a community group south of Baton Rouge called St. Gabriel Carvel, and ostensibly we were organizing around whatever issues that folks cared about, which in this case happened to be this huge toxic waste facility they were building in a low-income African-American community. And but it also tied in with some of the state tax break work that they were doing. And it was a really exciting campaign. And I'll just share a couple of war stories because it was so exciting that it got me hooked. And 20 years later, I'm still doing this work because, you know, it's inspiring to have a huge victory as your first real organizing job. And so I was part of this group, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and there were times when I had city council people threatening civil disobedience, and I'm like, wow, you're on the city council and you're telling the sheriff that he better, you know, bring his wagon down here because they're going to be hauling people off the road. We're not going to let this facility be built in this community. And then the climax of this campaign was we had, they were holding a Department of Environmental Quality hearing in this gymnasium. And we had about 400, 500 people in this gymnasium, this little tiny town, right? And there were 400 or 500 people in the town. And the industry spokesperson got up and told this wonderful, the most incredible open mouth insert foot comment I'd ever heard, right? She stood up, she was one of the engineers. Well, when we located this facility, we located it in a relatively unpopulated area. The audience went ballistic. They're like, what do you mean, we live here? And they're screaming, they're shouting. I thought chairs were going to start flying, right? Department of Environmental Quality spokesperson slams down the gavel, kicks everyone out, or says, you guys, we're going to take a recess, we're going to come back in 5 minutes after you all have calmed down. She steps off. It takes about 10, 15 minutes before everyone really calms down. She finally comes back on, and she's ready. All right, we're going to restart this hearing, but before we start, Sheriff Petrie wants to have a word with you. Sheriff Petrie gets up to the microphone. He leans in the microphone with a thick Cajun accent and says...
Common for that area.
That's right, that's right. He says, we're going to restart this hearing, but before we restart it, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. This is a public hearing, and it's time for these people to listen to what the public has to say. He's pointing at the DEQ spokesperson. Her jaw drops. I'm like, he's elected. He ain't touching us. Then to call in the state police because the county sheriff wouldn't touch us. Parish sheriff, excuse me, it's Louisiana. But anyway, it was really exciting campaigns. And in the end, we did win. We defeated the plant. We knew when we got the call from the governor's office saying, you know, we want you all to come on down and send some representatives to a press conference the governor's going to hold. I'm like, he ain't inviting us there if they're approving it. You know, they're denying it. We knew at that moment we'd won. So it was exciting. It was a year of my life that was really exciting and got me hooked. Since then, I've worked with groups like Louisiana Citizen Action, running canvas crews all over Louisiana, Louisiana mostly.
You know Dan Nicolai.
Yes.
Works in this building.
Dan
right here.
and I, Dan And Dan worked in the same office with me when I was with LCTJ.
Sure.
I blew up his car battery once, hooking the battery cables up
Yeah, well,
backwards.
there's some things you need to learn.
But anyway, no, Dan and I have known each other since then.
He was with ACORN in Minnesota and then came down to the ASF campaign.
Yeah, he was working with Labor Neighbor at the time down in the
Right.
Baton Rouge office,
Right.
which we shared an office with at LCTJ.
Small world.
Yeah. Then I worked up in Kentucky for a few years organizing family farmers with a group called Community Farm Alliance, fighting the ConAgras and the big corporate things. Then I spent 12 years working as director of a group in Tennessee called Tennesseans for Fair Taxation. And we were at the forefront of a big campaign to enact a state income tax in Tennessee as part of a big progressive reform package. And then in 2009, I came on as the executive director at United for a Fair Economy and have been here since. So that's just my story, and there's a million war stories in there, which isn't why we're here today, but I might come back to one or two of them because they're relevant for this discussion. As Wade says, United for a Fair Economy we're a national organization. We've been around for around 18 years, and it was founded to really raise awareness and around the dangers of extreme inequality and promote policies and organizing that foster a more broadly shared prosperity. So, since the late 90s, mid 90s, when we saw what was happening from all these massive tax giveaways, the Reagan years, the early Bush years, and even the Clinton years, this economy was taking a very, very radically different trajectory than it had in previous decades. And so UFE was formed to really focus on this and really work at policies to address it. Throughout those years, we've taken a lot of angles. And in broad terms, I view the solutions to inequality in three different ways: leveling up, leveling down, and strengthening the commons. And leveling up, I'm thinking things like minimum wage, living wage campaigns, the rights of workers to organize, things that ensure that there's a floor in the economic system. Leveling down, I'm thinking progressive tax policies, limits on CEO pay, curbs on extreme wealth and inheritance. And then strengthening the commons, I view as things that make the first two almost irrelevant. Not almost irrelevant, they're less relevant, which is moving things out of the market into the public sector, healthcare. Make healthcare available to everyone, it doesn't matter if they can afford it or not. Makes public education available to everyone, it's less, so there's the strengthening of the commons. And so I view inequality through those three lenses. And a big part of UFE's work, we've dealt with minimum living wage campaigns, we've dealt with CEO pay limits, and we do delve into a lot of these areas, but a lot of our work is around progressive tax policies. And I think of that as a twofer, because one, it's leveling down. The more progressive of a tax policy you have, the more you can limit the extreme. With a strong estate tax, you can limit that extreme wealth at the top, and that generates funding to strengthen the commons. So I view that as addressing two sides of that, two aspects of the inequality work. In all this work, there's and I'm going to skip to what Wade, what we talked about as far as the main purpose for being here is how do we talk about inequality in our work? How do we engage communities around issues of inequality? A lot of folks, and this is where framing comes in, and I think a big part of our working is around framing and messaging. There's a fundamental difference between inequality and poverty, right? A lot of people like to view these issues as issues of poverty, right? As opposed to an issue of inequality. If you view this issue as an issue of poverty, then you have a very different set of policy solutions. You're not acknowledging the fact that the reason these people are poor is because so much wealth is concentrated in these few hands. And so if you view things as inequality, and we almost never use the poverty lens or the poverty frame when we talk about the work that we do, because the poverty frame generally puts the blame on the people in the positions of poverty for their conditions, by failing to acknowledge the role of inequality in keeping them in those conditions, because inequality creates power structures that create multiple barriers that overlay and essentially prevent people from moving out of that position of being at the bottom of the inequality ladder, of being in a low-income situation. That's one of the frames that we do, and there's a lot we can talk about. And I'm going to we'll just go back and forth, but I'm going to just lay out some of the thinking that we use for our work. And a second frame that we focus on a lot is a frame around where wealth comes from. And we've written a lot of publications over the years. We have a very interesting project at UFE called Responsible Wealth. It's unique. It's interesting, and part of it is a heritage of one of UFE's founders, a guy named Chuck Collins, who was heir to the Oscar Mayer fortune, right? That was his grandfather or something like that, and so he came from a family of wealth, and he had a lot of access to other families of wealth through various networks that he was a part of. And so UFE early on formed this project called Responsible Wealth, where we got a lot of high wealth people to say, look, I was born this way. I didn't work my way up the ladder. I didn't bust my tail. This wealth was just given to me. And because there's a lot of frame, and then even those that we organized that weren't inheritors, that maybe they did start a business, whatever we were able to access and build into, who really, because one of the narratives that we have in this country is this narrative of entrepreneurship, of being self-made, of bootstrapping your way up. And it's a way of glorifying and elevating those at the top of the economic ladder and justifying their wealth as purely a result of their hard work, right? Their brilliance, their insights, their leadership, without acknowledging all the other reasons that they're in that position. They were born with wealth. They were white. They were male. They had personal connections. They benefited from massive public investments in GI bills, in road construction, in all types of things that are supported through our tax dollars. But it's a frame, and there's a reason when you look at the past presidential election in the United States, and you saw Obama say, "You didn't build that," right? And of course, how many folks are familiar with that quote? Okay, most of you have heard that, and of course he was referencing the business. Elizabeth Warren did a much better riff on that. Yeah. When she did you built this business, good for you, but you did it using the schools, workers educated in the schools we all paid for. You did it you shipped your good on the roads that we all paid to build. You built your business was protected by the court system we all pay to maintain. Good for you, you built the business, keep a chunk of it, but you owe a chunk of that back to society for, to pay it forward. And that's essentially a big part of the messaging that we do to sort of challenge this narrative. And we've done a few things. I should have brought the book. We wrote a book earlier this year called The Self-Made Myth, where we interviewed a bunch of these business folks, and they really outed themselves. Like, look, I got GI Bills, I went to this, I got this benefit, I got Pell Grants, I got all these government benefits, and my business got, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money to pay for workers. Our workers are educated in public schools, and they go on about all the different ways that their businesses are made possible and making the case for why they should pay progressive tax policies. We have another one called Born on Third Base, which again challenges this notion. This is an examination of the Forbes 400 list, where we look at them and really show that of the Forbes 400, roughly 40% were either born on the list or born well on their way to the list. And then even beyond that, there's significant advantages most of the rest of them got. So that at this point, of the Forbes 400, I think 386 are white, and like 90% are male. And there's you've got those identity privileges which would play into that as well. And so that's a big part of the narrative that we deal with. But then coming to the question of how do you talk about this, because one of the things that we've learned is that you can't just give people statistics. You can't just give people numbers when you talk about inequality. You need to, one, give them narratives. You need to give them stories that mean something. And you need to draw their own stories out. And that's when it comes to the popular education side of it, which I'll jump to in a minute. So when I think of how do we engage people on issues of inequality in a way that's meaningful for their work, I think of three different areas. One, there's the visual, there's our online stuff, which is getting more and more important all the time, right? And so we try to make things creative, we try to make things visual, so that we can capture some of those narratives, and we have a lot of good. Where's one of ours? Here's a little. This is, of course, this is an interesting way. I'll pass these out. This is an infographic we kicked out last year, and it sort of poses a question. In this case, we took the total wealth of the Forbes 400. Is that the Forbes 400? Is it the 400 wealthiest?
Yeah, wealthiest Americans. Yeah, richest 400.
If you took the total wealth of the wealthiest 400 people in the United States, what could you do with that money? And put together this visual, which says, well, hypothetically, if you, in this case, you have to confiscate it all, but you could basically, I forget, what's one of those, can you want to read off one of those things?
A new car for every family in the U.S.
Here.
What's the college loan one?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Pay off every student loan for every single student in the U.S.
I mean, that's an extraordinary amount of money in the hands of 400 people that could do that. And it really lifts up this inequality thing. That infographic probably got more web traffic than anything we've done in a decade. I mean, you can see it on our, we just earlier this week, we did a huge media rollout with our Responsible Wealth Project where we got a number of, these are people who don't give us money, but they occasionally lend us their name. We were able to get Warren Buffett, George Soros, President Carter, Robert Rubin, and a bunch of other folks signing off on this letter calling for a strong estate tax. Huge media press. We were in just about every major publication in this country on Monday and Tuesday of this week, right? And you can see that spike in our web traffic. That infographic probably generated 5 times the web traffic of all that media we just did this month on Monday. I mean, it just went viral. It just went all over the net. And it's an example of how you can talk about inequality in a way that's meaningful to people. And one of the things I talk about is a concept called social math. How many folks have heard that term, social math? It's thinking of a way, because numbers don't mean anything to people. Numbers are just numbers. They're abstract, right? What is, whatever what's the total wealth it says at the top of that thing? Whatever trillion? 1.37 trillion is an inconceivable number. It doesn't mean anything to most people because it's so out of the bounds of anything that any of us have any experience with. So you have to put it in language that means something. And that's what this thing does. This thing uses social math. It says, well, that's enough money to do X, Y, Z. We've done other ones where we've and don't quote me on this number, but like, if you took the wealth, because I forget what the number was, but this is an example of social math. We sat down and took the measurements of a U.S. dollar bill. Okay, a U.S. dollar bill is 5 inches wide, let's say. And then just did the math. If you took the wealth of the Walton family in U.S. dollars, what does that mean? Well, you can go from from Earth to the moon and back. Things like that. That's social math. It's an example of making these numbers meaningful, more meaningful than 1.7 trillion, which doesn't mean a darn thing to most people, right?
But in America, almost everybody's been to the moon and back. So
that's right.
It all adds up then.
And so that's and then I'm gonna jump on one other. So I mean, a lot of folks. How many folks have organized rallies, marches? Have you all used creative theatrics in those rallies and marches?
Yes,
Yeah.
What'd you say? We tried.
We've tried.
That's right. That's pretty straightforward.
Or less creative.
Yeah.
I mean, and sometimes
We have a
those
hammer. Everything's a nail.
sometimes those creative tactics can touch on the social math, or at least provide a powerful visual that gives people a way to connect with a number that is more meaningful. We used to do back when I was in Tennessee, and this is one of those war stories. We had one of my favorite actions that we did. We were sitting around the office trying to brainstorm. We needed to do a big rally in Nashville. How can we do this? How can we make these numbers meaningful? People aren't connecting with this, right? And so we had this brainstorm. We were like, well, why don't we do a May Day march? The big old socialist holiday. And we had this office manager in our office who had no background in leftist theory or anything like that. She goes, and it needed someone in the room like that who could give a totally different spin on May Day. She's like, yeah, May Day's like a distress call. We go, oh yeah, that's right, it is a distress call, Mayday, Mayday. And so we did a Mayday march that was themed on Mayday, Mayday, we're 49th in sinking. Tennessee being 49th in education funding per capita of the 50 states, 49th in revenue collected per capita of the 50 states. And we were, of course, calling for a more, additional revenue. And so we got people from buses from all over the state hauling into Nashville. We probably had about 600 people or so hauled into the state. And we did this whole Mayday march. People came dressed with life preservers. They were wearing life vests, carrying boat oars up to the state capitol. And we had this great graphic of the ship sinking with USS Tennessee, 49th in sinking, Mayday, Mayday. And it gave a totally, fun spin to the leftist holiday, the old labor holiday on Mayday. And then we even did this one, and this goes to a little bit, it's not really social math, but it's an example of 49th doesn't even mean anything to a lot of people. And so what we did is we took a roll of paper and we listed all the states in order of funding for education, right? And we had it, and so we stood on the front of the Capitol and we just rolled it out. And of course, you're looking at every other state in the country. And then finally, of course, this is rolling all the way down the steps of the Capitol, down near the foot of it. And then there at the bottom, you see just above Mississippi, Tennessee. And it's an example of how you can do that. And so from there, I'll segue into the true popular education, and then we're going to pull some chairs in here. I'm going to show you an example of one of the exercises that we do at United for a Fair Economy, which and a lot of other groups do. Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is one of the founders of a concept called popular education. And I'm going to make a distinction between popular education and participatory, visual, social math stuff. Because in the purest sense, popular education, I believe, cannot be done in a workshop. Popular education takes months, years of relationship building and getting to know people in a deep way, right? Because popular education, there's a dry erase. There's a concept here. I'm going to use this dry erase. Is there a dry erase?
Help yourself. Yeah, they've got.
Take down those things there.
Yeah, those are old. You can.
That's revolutionary stuff, John.
There you go. Thank you for that.
In Freire's writings, and what Freire is basically arguing is that the traditional model of leadership, the traditional model of teaching, puts the teacher and then the class down here, right? And the teacher is bestowing knowledge on the class. Even if we go into a group and we're citing all kinds of statistics and numbers, right? And we're the organizer. Maybe we're the organizer. Maybe we're the community leader. We're reinforcing the same model that people get in a classroom. And yes, you can convey knowledge, you can convey information, but you're simultaneously teaching these people that they don't have the information themselves, that they need to count on others to provide them for them. It's a disempowering model is what Freire basically argues, right? It's very disempowering to people, and if your goal is not just to convey information, but also to give people a sense of their own power, then you need to rethink the way you do teaching, rethink the way you do leadership development. And so, and that's where you get to the old, which many of you I'm sure do in your community groups, where you start drawing on everyone's knowledge and being patient and hearing people. And now the facilitator still plays a key role in that discussion, but you're asking questions. So instead of having a bunch of information in the PowerPoint projector and just dumping a bunch of information on people, you set up a series of questions, right, that draw out. And sometimes they're leading questions. Now Freire would argue against leading questions, I think, but we're organizers. We do leading questions. You know where you want to go, and I personally have no problem with leading questions because I think we do have an agenda. At least when I'm doing a workshop, I want to raise awareness about, say, a tax system. Now, this may not make any sense to the folks in this room because Canada has a very different sales tax than we have in the United States. As I understand, yours is technically a value-added tax, so it plays out a little differently than ours does. Most states in the United States have what's a straight sales tax, and it's usually only applied to goods. It doesn't apply to services like attorney fees and whatnot. Back when I was in Tennessee, and I'm going to make so let me make a distinction. So in Freery's idea, you know, you're basically, I'm going to tell one story of one of my favorite examples of something that's sort of a pop-ed theory. And this was back from the Civil Rights era, when they were doing literacy schools, right, in the South. Because in order to be able to register to vote, African Americans and anyone had to be able to read, right? And you had to prove you could read to go to the polls and vote. And so they had these literacy schools that they were training people how to read, teaching adults. And the problem is you can't go to an adult with a book that says see, spot, run. It's demeaning. It's like, whatever, you know, this is like silly. And so what the educator would do, what the organizers would do, is they would go out, it was very time-consuming, extremely labor-intensive, I'll admit that. But they went down, and like my job was to talk to you, right, and teach you to read. I'd sit down with you, I'd spend my first day sitting down with you, asking you to tell me the story of your life. Where'd you come from? Who were your parents, right? I'm taking furious notes, maybe I'm recording it. I go back, I write all that down, right? I try to clean it all up, whatever, I get typed. I come back to you and I teach you to read your own life story. You know, it's very empowering because it validates their experiences. You know, it tells you your life is important enough to write down, right? And it's so empowering, it's beautiful. And that would be an example of some of the ways that Freery would think of it. And that with a pop-ed model, because your goal isn't just to dump information, your goal is simultaneously to give them a sense of their own worth and a sense of their own value. That's a pure pop-ed model. And again, I'm not going to get too much in that theory, but most of what we do, and I'll admit most of what we do is a bit shy of that, just because we're usually limited to a couple of hours, an hour in front of a group doing a workshop. You can't build that deep of a relationship with someone to be able to do that kind of work. But you could still use some of the elements. And so, you know, if you're going to design a module, design it where you're asking questions, right? And so one of the workshop modules, well, okay, so let me say that. So part of it is this is about drawing from people's own experience. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to give a couple of examples of workshops. There's a model here. I can't do it. There's a graphic that we have. I'm going to do this. And then, right, now forget how it goes. I'm just doing this. There's someone who did this thing called the learning heads. And if you see only, you know, you get a bunch of information, you see it. Or maybe you hear it. And maybe it starts with here, and then it goes to here and see. I think it actually starts with here, but let's start with here. If you hear that information only, a week later you might retain 10% of that information, best chance. If you hear and see, you might get up to 20-30%. You hear, see, and say, vocalize, back. You might get up to 40%, 50%. Hear, see, say, and do. Then you're starting to approach like 70-80% retention, right? And so the goal is to engage as many of those senses as you can when you're talking to people about these issues, right? So on one hand, we want to create experiences that are real, that are tangible, that people can feel, that they can see, that they can be a part of. If possible, we want to design workshop modules that ask questions, right? So this one I don't have the props for, so I'm just going to describe it. And this is the sales tax. This is goes back to the sales tax module, which both ask questions, but it also gets people doing at least these three. You know, doesn't quite get to doing, but it gets them to these three. And what he used to do is he used to get these cutouts of these flashcards, and on each flashcard we would put a word, you know, food, a little picture of some food. Toys, picture of a bicycle. car parts, a picture of a car part, right? And I would go in front of the audience and I would ask them a question. Hey all, in order to understand the Tennessee tax system, the first and most important thing to do is to understand the sales tax, because that's where 70–80% of our state revenue comes from, because we don't have an income tax, right? And so we're going to have a little discussion about the sales tax in Tennessee. And I've got a board here, and it has a big line down the middle, a line on top, and it has a yes side and a no side. And the question on top is this item subject to a sales tax, right? And so I'm asking the audience, I'm saying, look, I'm going to hold up a flashcard, and I want you to tell me, is this taxed or not under a sales tax, right? And I want you to shout that answer out, right? So I'm holding up the first flashcard. Groceries. This is Tennessee, so the answer is actually yes. Yes! Boom. Car parts. Yes! Boom. Clothing. Yes! Attorney fees.
No.
No. Maid or house cleaning service. No. Going down the list, here's some good ones. Private school tuition. No. Stocks and bonds. No. Toys. Yes. Appliances. Yes. Furniture. Yes. By the time they're done with this workshop, you've got one side of this chart that is, food, clothing, car parts, furniture, all those consumable goods that you buy at a store, at a bricks and mortar store. On the right side is all the services, the savings and investments, the real estate, the private school tuitions, the attorney fees, the limousine service, none of which are subject to a sales tax. And then I asked the audience, I said, now I want you to ask me two questions. I want to ask you a question. I want you to visualize two families. One family making $20,000 a year and one family making $200,000 a year. That family making $20,000 a year, what side of this chart do you think they're going to spend most of their money on? Invariably, I could be at the most conservative group you can imagine, a Farm Bureau meeting, and they would say, the yes side. Right, okay. What about the family making $200,000? The no side. And then people got it. I could have gone in there with a PowerPoint projector and tried to argue how a sales tax is a regressive tax. I just achieved the same thing without ever using the word regressive, which is a wonky term that most people have no idea what it means, right? But also asked questions. They told me what was taxed and what wasn't. They told me what a $20,000 family spends their money on, what a $200,000 family. I didn't tell them, which also disarms people. Because, if I had gone in there with a PowerPoint projector and just said this, I can guarantee you half to two-thirds of that audience would have locked down and said, oh, whatever, that's this person's opinion, But by eliciting the actions from them, in this case, it helped. It was very disarming. It helped engage in every audience I've ever done that workshop at. I've never had anything other than that conclusion, and people get it. And they finally understand, oh, now I understand why a sales tax hits the low-income families harder. It's not because we pay different rates. We all pay the same 7% rate, but it applies to a very different share of the goods that we buy. Now, one note on Canada, I don't know much about the way your tax system is set up, but I did look a little bit last night on the research. And apparently you have what's called a value-added tax, and so it's taxed at different levels. And then, so yours does solve some of these problems, but not all of them. Because a lot of the services, I think, might be taxed in Canada. So if you did this with Canada tax, some of those services like attorney fees might be on this side. But things like stocks and bonds are still on this side. So it's still regressive, not as regressive as a true sales tax, because you still have people who spend most of their money on Wall Street, or, where is that in Canada? Bay Street. So they still get a large chunk of their expenditures on this side of the chart that they're not paying that tax on. So it's still regressive. It's not as bad as a sales tax in the U.S. That's an example of this workshop. I'm going to do one more, and I'm going to need about 3 volunteers to help me pull a bunch of chairs in the next room here. Actually, I'm going to get all 4